nos dirá Loli cuántos. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a la ciudad de les Arts y les Ciències. Esta tarde tenemos con nosotros de nuevo al British Council, que, como sabéis, es un gran colaborador de la ciudad con la Sociedad de las Artes y las Ciencias y siempre nos trae unos conferenciantes de muy primer nivel. Tenemos también hoy con nosotros a Belén Fortea, que ella es la responsable del programa de ciencia del British Council en España y nos va a realizar una pequeña introducción de nuestra conferenciante de hoy. Cuando quieras, Belén.
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos a esta charla sobre el beneficio de las vacunas para nuestras sociedades. ¿Realmente lo apreciamos? Donde tenemos el placer de contar con la presencia de la profesora Beate Kapman. Beate Kapman es catedrática de Infecciones Pediátricas e Inmunidad y actualmente ocupa el cargo de directora del Centro de Vacunas del London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Sus principales áreas de investigación son la tuberculosis pediátrica y la vacunología. Desde julio del 2010 dirige un proyecto de vacunología en Gambia, donde lidera un equipo de más de 80 científicos con el objetivo de mejorar la salud mundial, con especial énfasis en la salud de los niños y de sus madres en África Occidental. Además, es la directora de Imprint, una red global centrada en la inmunización materna y neonatal. En esta charla, la profesora Kapman nos hablará sobre la importancia de las vacunas para el individuo, la salud pública y las sociedades globales, y sobre cómo podríamos llegar a hacer realidad la aspiración de la Organización Mundial de la Salud de que haya vacunas para todos en todas partes. No me extiendo más. Muchas gracias a todos por venir y espero que disfrutéis de la conferencia.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Yo no hablo muy bien español y no hablo valenciano de todo. Es por eso que voy a presentar en inglés. Excuse me, but this is going to have to be my language. Es la primera vez en Valencia y me gusta mucho. Muchas gracias de invitarme para esta presentación. The subject of my talk is the benefit of vaccines to our societies and do we really appreciate them? ¿Se puede escuchar bien? ¿Sí? Sí. Espero que la ciencia será muy interactiva y es posible de preguntar al final y si también ustedes no comprenden lo que yo digo, me pregunta, yo puedo interrumpir, no hace problema. Gracias. So when I think about vaccines, a big word cloud comes up in my mind. And that word cloud has many, many elements. And I can see many young students in this audience who probably are more familiar with word clouds than me. But you also can see that the word cloud focuses very much on the biology of vaccines. You have antibodies, which happens to be a part of the immune system. You focus on bacteria and viruses. There is even more about the immune system. A few vaccines are mentioned. And just in the corner here, there are a few ideas about public health and how maybe traveling, public health, risk and safety are mentioned. And yet, more and more, we're thinking about the vaccines in the context of public health, of safety, and what our own risks might be. And my talk tonight hopefully brings together some of the thoughts around not just how vaccines are made and what they do, but also what they do beyond the individual. So who in this room has heard of coronavirus? Oh, come on, you all must be reading the newspapers. Yes, great, so everybody has heard of coronavirus. Who in this room would take a coronavirus vaccine if it was available tomorrow? Okay, quite a few. There are some really fancy, many more people who would take a coronavirus vaccine. This is quite interesting to me because when you think about the coronavirus outbreak, you have some very fancy tools now. There's a very good website here from the Johns Hopkins University, which on a daily basis maps the cases of coronavirus as they have evolved in the world. And when I made this slide on Tuesday, there were 73,000 confirmed cases. There were about 2,000 deaths by now, and also a lot of recovered patients. And then on this interactive map, you can go through all the countries in the world and you can see where the virus might have arrived by now. And when you look at Spain, Spain had 2 cases, and yet you're all prepared to take a vaccine for a disease that your country has barely seen. So you wonder why that is and how we make these decisions. And that's what I want to try and work through tonight. ¿Cómo llegamos a las decisiones sobre la vacunación? Are these decisions for ourselves, or are they decisions because of a very high risk that we perceive because a new disease has arisen, or what is really driving those decisions? So I want to touch on what the success story of vaccines is, a little bit about how vaccines work. I'm not going to give a large talk about the immune system, you will be pleased to know. Who benefits from the vaccines? How does this have to do with our confidence in the product and how we might make our decisions? How we can use vaccines in outbreaks? And then I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. And I'd really encourage you to ask questions, anything you want about vaccines, and I will try and give some answers. I work both as a pediatrician, so I advise parents on the choice of vaccines for their children, and I work in Africa for half of my time, so I can also see the perspective of vaccines for public health in a setting where people get ill from infectious diseases a lot more. And I work in the UK in an academic institution where we're trying to also model a little bit the impact of new vaccines on our societies and societies abroad. So the first thing, facts should really speak for themselves. And when you think about vaccines and their successes, it is really important to know that more than 14 million deaths are estimated to have been prevented by just the measles vaccine between 2011 and 2020. So that's really a success, which is extraordinary for a single vaccine. Many of you might also be conscious of the fact that there are still a lot of children under the age of 5 dying, in particular in developing countries, but that we've had some progress on these numbers. And between 1990 and 2017, so nearly 20 years, from just about 1 in 10 children dying to 3 in 10 children dying, there has been a huge decline in mortality, which is still too high, but it's a huge success, and that is primarily through vaccination. And overall, the routine childhood immunization programs are preventing more than 2.5 million deaths by year. And that's led to the conclusion that, together with clean water, vaccines are the most cost-effective intervention to save lives. And I'll come back to the cost-effectiveness argument in a little while. So the best success story of vaccination is obviously around smallpox. The majority of the people in this room would not have received a vaccine against smallpox because the disease was eradicated by 1980, and a lot of this audience is younger than even 40 years old. So in the times when there was still smallpox around, 1 in 3 people died of this disease. So it really was a terrible disease. And you can see, the disfigurement that smallpox was causing. But in 1980, smallpox was declared eradicated because through introduction of the vaccine, the numbers had gone down so much that not a single case was found in the world anymore. And for the first time, an entire pathogen had disappeared from the face of the earth. So this is an enormous triumph, which so far we haven't quite achieved, although there are a couple of diseases which are quite close. One of them is polio. Polio is a very disabling infection which leaves a number of people who get the infection paralyzed. And in the old days, there were people walking around with crutches, and just on this picture here from India, you can see the debilitating consequences that polio has had. So the vaccine against polio was introduced in the 1980s, and here you see the number of cases that we had in the 1980s and how they have decreased over the years as the vaccine coverage has gone up and up and up, and now more than 90% of the world have received immunization against polio. which has resulted in a really significant change of the landscape around polio infection. So if you looked at this landscape on the world map in 1988, all those countries in red still had cases of polio. If you look at that landscape now, and this is even a map from 2017, there were only 3 countries left: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And the good news is Nigeria hasn't seen a case of polio for the last 3 years, so it will soon be, if all goes well, declared eradicated in Nigeria as well, eliminated in Nigeria as well. So what we have really prevented are 350,000 cases of wild polio across 125 countries. There were only 33 cases in 2 countries, and overall 18 million cases of paralysis being averted with this vaccine. The only way that we can maintain this level of elimination is to keep on vaccinating, because there's still some wild polio going around, and there's a big polio endgame funded by the Gates Foundation and the WHO trying to really get polio out of the world, which would be a fantastic achievement. Now, talking about measles, who in this room has had measles when they were children? Or in any other, okay, few people have had measles. I had measles when I was a kid. And most of you would have been vaccinated against measles, because the measles vaccine has been around since 1963. And in a combination with mumps and rubella, it's been around since 1969. So these are data from the US. And in 1958, there were 763,000 cases of measles. That's just in the US alone. And here you can see the graph, how that went down when the measles vaccine was introduced. But also here, you can see that over the years, and especially in the last 4 to 5 years, the measles cases have crept up again. And I will come back to that, because we need to really ask ourselves, why has this happened? And here you can see in 2000, measles was eliminated in the US, and in 2019, we have all these cases. And the US is not a single country where this has happened. The UK lost its measles-free status last year as well. So here's the example of the vaccines that are routinely used for children and young people in Spain. And if you look at the measles vaccine, for example, you have 2 doses of this, one at 1 year of age and then one at 2 or 3 years of age. And overall, Spain has done a good job in keeping their vaccine coverage. Here you can see the 2nd dose of measles and rubella-containing vaccines that were given within Europe. And here you can see the countries where there have been a lack of getting over 90%, and England is one of them, France is one of them. But in Spain, you had between 90 and 94% coverage, so you're pretty much safe. However, you really want 95%, and your neighbors here in Portugal have achieved that. And we'll come back to the measles question in a little moment. So you might want to know a little bit more about how vaccines are developed. And it's a long and sometimes very thorny path, and only maybe 1 vaccine candidate in 10 will eventually make it through that system. And it used to be every vaccine would be developed through an empirical approach, a little bit like trial and error. So conjugate vaccines were only coming in, so these are the newer generation of vaccines in the last 10 to 15 years. And before, the vaccines against tuberculosis, diphtheria, pertussis, polio, they resulted from a much more rudimentary technology where every single vaccine was made in a separate way, whilst now we have platforms where vaccines are made according to categories. So, as I said, historically, every single vaccine was customized to each individual antigen that could be a virus or a bacterial pathogen, and individually made. And now we understand that we can use some of these technologies in combination. And we now have platforms, especially for viral vaccines. And some of these platforms are currently being used to make a vaccine against coronavirus, for example. You might also want to know how the vaccines work. And this is a very simple cartoon to illustrate the point. So the pathogen, be it bacterium or virus, will be attenuated in some way, which means it is weakened in the way that it cannot cause any disease, and that can be done in various ways. It is then combined with like an enforcer of the immune response, which is called an adjuvant. And through inoculation, it reaches our immune system, and we put down memory cells, literally like saving up in the bank. In a bit more detail, this looks like this. So the vaccine stimulates the body's immune response to create these antibodies by injecting the vaccine or giving it as an oral vaccine. Then the antibodies, when they see the disease, will bind to the disease and will actually help the immune system to fend it off. In a bit more detail, this is more complicated. So you have the particular parts of the immune system which are called B lymphocytes, which relate to production of the antibody, or you have what's called T cells, which relate to pathogens that are intracellular and needs to be gobbled up by immune cells before they can be defended by this part of the immunity. But what's common for all of this is like that the concentration of the defense mechanisms that we produce in terms of antibody depends on the boosting, which means if you have the first wave of infection or vaccination, you get a small peak, and you put down literally some memory cells in your lymph nodes and your spleen and your bone marrow that will remember that antigen. And then if you get a second exposure, be it the vaccine or the disease, you will very quickly augment the defense mechanisms. And that means you can fight it off much more effectively. That means this response is much faster and it's also much larger. And that's the reason why we need to have more than one injection with plenty of our vaccines. For example, all the childhood vaccines need more than one injection, because with the first injection, you kind of start creating this memory response. And with the second or third injection, you augment the capability of your immune system to fight off the infection very, very effectively. Now, as I said, not every vaccine candidate makes it, and we'll talk about these sort of valleys of death. So vaccine development is really quite a lengthy process, and from discovery in the laboratory to what we call preclinical phase, which means the construct of the vaccine is put into usually animal models to start with before we go into any human trials. So the first vaccine tested in humans will be in healthy adult volunteers to make sure that the vaccine is safe, that nobody gets too sore an arm or get a high fever, etc. And only if that is sure will the vaccine go further in a phase 2, where we see whether the vaccine actually introduces the kind of immune response that we expect to be needed to fight off the real infection when we see it. And then we'll test the vaccine in large trials in people who might be susceptible to the infection, and we see if the vaccine really prevents the infection against it is being designed. And only then can the vaccine be licensed, and between this and this is often a period of about 10 years or so. This is different with the new platforms. So for the coronavirus vaccine, for example, you might have heard that people think we might be able to have a vaccine in a year's time because we're now using these new technology platforms. However, we are at the preclinical part of these vaccines, and the first studies have only just started going into animals, and they still have to have safety studies, and they still have to have immunogenicity and efficacy studies. And you can see that between the discovery and the preclinical to the product, there are these what we call the valleys of death, where a lot of candidates just drop off. And the investment that has to be done up front to see a vaccine through is actually quite substantial. Even if we have the vaccines, I think we still have what I would call a third valley of death, because many vaccines are developed but not necessarily taken up. And it can be a long delay between a vaccine being licensed and an immunization program in a country deciding that they want to have that vaccine in their schedule. Just to give you an example from the UK, the chickenpox vaccine has been licensed for many years, and many countries are using it. But in the UK, it's still not introduced, because in the UK, vaccines get introduced by a cost-effectiveness model, and on cost-effectiveness, that vaccine hasn't come out as being so advantageous. So we're still fighting to get a good vaccine that is available through the overall public program to bring it to all the children. Also, despite of all the vaccines being there, not everybody is currently getting them. And this graph summarizes the sort of global trends that there have been between rolling vaccines out. Here you see vaccines introduced in the 1980s and the coverage going up and up and up. And in many countries, the number of unvaccinated children going down and down and down. And what you can see here in this color code is that the countries where this trend hasn't really quite followed this pattern are the blue and the red ones. And the blue one is the African region, and the red one is the Southeast Asian region. So many of you can see here the European region, and the European region has literally done 90 to 100% of introducing all these vaccines. But there is some more work to do, and it leaves about 20 million children still vulnerable to vaccine-preventable diseases. And from a global health perspective, there's still a lot more to do. So coming away from the individual use of vaccines to what do vaccines do for the community, because this is a little bit the tone that I wanted to bring to the discussion today. So if you imagine you have a person who gets an infectious disease, let's say it is an infectious disease that would transmit with what's called a reproducibility ratio of 2, which means every person who has this infection can potentially transmit it to 2 other people. And then those 2 people can transmit it to another 2 people. So before the end of the week, if it's a quick cycle of transmission, you'd have 4 people infected, and then you can imagine the knock-on effect. If you now decide to vaccinate maybe even 1 out of those 2 people where the disease could be transmitted to. So this is 50% of the people that you could think about having had the vaccine. The pattern of transmission changes quite dramatically because the people who've had the vaccine are not going to get the disease now, and the people who can transmit the disease can only give it to the unvaccinated person, who will then also get ill, but it's not going to be transmitted from that unvaccinated person to the vaccinated people, and the vaccinated person is not going to transmit it anyway. And you can simulate this at a population level. So if you look at these graphs, you have in blue anyone who is susceptible, and then in green anyone who's had the vaccine, and in red the way that the infectious disease would spread through the community if you had various degrees of vaccination. So ultimately, if nobody is vaccinated, everybody would get it. If 40% are vaccinated, you can see there's already quite a lot of protection. If you have 90% of the population vaccinated, hardly anyone gets it. And with 95%, which is what we're looking for when we're wanting to protect against measles, just a very few people would be infected, and everybody literally has turned green. And the people who have turned green and being the protected people indirectly protect the ones that are still blue. And not everybody might be able to get the vaccine for various reasons, because it's not available, or maybe their immune system isn't working in a way that the vaccine would be good for them. So what we're creating with vaccinating the people around them is like an umbrella of protection, and we call that community immunity, or you might have also heard the word herd immunity. I like the term community immunity better because it relates more to people rather than to a bunch of sheep. So how do we then decide who should be vaccinated? Should we vaccinate the small children? Should we vaccinate their mothers? Should we vaccinate the grandparents? And what does that actually depend on? And the first consideration is, who are the people who are going to be most vulnerable to the disease against we want to protect? You might know, for example, in Spain you now have the HPV vaccine, which is given to teenage girls. And there the onus is on trying to protect young women and women in general. So there's a very specific mandate for a vaccine to protect against a disease, which is cervical cancer in this case, which primarily affects grown-up women. So you would have your vaccine particularly for that group. If you're thinking about diseases that affect small children, for example, meningitis, you would want to give the vaccine to children as young as possible when they're growing up, so they would be protected. if you want to think about a disease that primarily is detrimental for older people, let's say flu, for example, then you might want to give the vaccine to the elderly. And I'll show you some simulations, again, how to predict what would be the best effect. You also want to protect the people who will have the most, severe disease. It depends a bit on the effectiveness of the vaccine, who should be getting it, the tolerance. For example, if you have people with a compromised immune system, to give them a vaccine that is made out of primarily life-attenuated particles might not be the greatest idea because they could have side effects from that. For example, the BCG vaccine is an excellent vaccine, but it's a life-replicating vaccine, and you wouldn't give that vaccine to someone with a very weak immune system or someone who's got HIV. But the gain for the individual always plays a role, but also the gain for the community needs to be understood. And here's an example. If we want to protect the elderly from flu, for example, I'll give you the example of the NHS, National Health Service in the UK. Flu vaccines are not cheap. So they cost about £16 per dose. That's about 18 euros or so. So it's important to deploy them in a way that we can get the best bang for the buck, so to say. So prior to 2013, these vaccines were offered free of charge only to the elderly. And since 2013, we are now offering them to under 18s and young children. And you might wonder, why did you bother with that? So if we had an elderly person, the chances are that that elderly person might be infected by flu through transmission of flu in the community that could come from much younger children, and often elderly people get their infections from the young children around them, often the grandchildren. So if you give the vaccine to the elderly person alone, it will be of benefit to the elderly person, but you would not be changing this chain of transmission. Whilst if you were giving the vaccine, let's say, to the teenagers, you would protect anyone upstream, but you wouldn't necessarily protect young children and pregnant women. So the best case scenario would be to give the vaccine to everyone, but would that be the best bang for your buck? And so there are various modeling techniques trying to find out how would you most effectively reduce the transmission of flu vaccine to the elderly. And here are three scenarios. You could give the vaccine to the preschool children, and you would then have the elderly with a slow uptake, and because they're quite separate as populations. And you had it depends a little bit, these curves are just trying to model whether you have a slow uptake of the vaccine, like, every year you get a few more people, or you'd have a fast uptake. So it wouldn't make a big difference. If you give it to the preschool and primary school children, then you would see that actually their immunity would start to have an impact on the uptake and the transmission for the elderly as well. And if you gave it to an even larger group of children, they would literally really influence the transmission that is going on in the elderly. And here's the speed. So with slow uptake, it would take you quite some years, or actually several months, to get protection for the community. If you have very fast uptake, it goes up very quickly and then stays like that. So these are sort of coverages in target pediatric groups. The more children you can cover with the vaccine, the more you're going to have an impact on the elderly population. And that has been the decision that, for example, the UK government has made about the flu vaccine. So now children over the age of 2 to 18 will get the vaccine, so they go into this preschool, primary, and secondary thing, and the elderly over 65 get the vaccine. And that is basically protecting the most vulnerable for the best economic outcome. So vaccine is much more than just an injection. And I think what I've already indicated is that the vaccine protects the individual, they can protect the community around that individual, but they can also protect the economy. So when I worked in West Africa during the Ebola crisis, I worked in a country that was very close to Ebola. Luckily, we didn't get any cases. But the tourism industry in West Africa was hugely impacted. Although there wasn't a single case of Ebola in the country called the Gambia where I work, the tourists just decided to all stay away. So the fact that there wasn't a vaccine against Ebola, although there were no cases, made everybody feel really frightened. And clearly not too many people were going on holiday to Sierra Leone or Liberia or Guinea-Conakry during that time. So tourism wasn't so much of an issue for them, because they had another lot of worries. But for the Gambia, which was a neighboring country, if there had been a vaccine, it would not have had an impact on their tourism industry, because people would have been able to protect themselves just as much as they protect themselves against yellow fever before they go to West Africa. So these outbreaks of infectious diseases can have huge impacts on the economy, including tourism. They also have huge impact on education because, a lot of people might not be able to attend school when they're unwell, and the measles cases, for example, have led to institutions literally screening for children for their vaccination records, etc. The outbreaks of coronavirus in China have made schools and universities close down. So outbreak scenarios have a huge impact on the educational sector. And we probably have to talk about security and national and global security in the context of outbreaks as well, because as you've just experienced with the coronavirus outbreak, a lot of travel has been stopped and people are worried about diseases traveling through borders without passports, of course. So vaccines do not only benefit the individual. I want to come to a topic that you might have thought about yourselves as well, and this is the topic of vaccine confidence and how people might have decided to give or not give vaccines to themselves or their children. And this is work from a group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine I work with from the Vaccine Confidence Project. And they launched a huge questionnaire which was worldwide distributed. And the Wellcome Trust did a report on this. And they tried to map the answer to the question of do you think that vaccines are generally safe? And people needed to reply if they were in agreement with this statement. So as you can see here, there are agreements and disagreements charted, and here we're just zooming in on a little bit of Europe. And for example, in France, 41% of the people were not in agreement with the statement that vaccines are safe. In England, that was 8.7%, very much like in Spain, where it was about 9%. But you can see that through regions, for example, in Eastern Europe, it was 25%, in Russia, 27%, in Iran, 22%, in the US, 13 or 14%. So many places, people answered that they were not in agreement with the statement that vaccines are safe. And we really need to ask ourselves, why is this? So vaccine hesitancy or lack of confidence in vaccination is not a new phenomenon. This is a cartoon from the late 18th century when the cowpox vaccine had been pioneered by Edward Jenner, who was the first person to actually prove the concept of vaccination. And this terrible cartoon shows Jenner here with a tail on his coat, throwing children into what was described as the vaccine monster, and then them coming out all mangled at the bottom. And the path to glory and money, and money coming out of people's pockets because of vaccination. So the idea that vaccines have side effects and that they can harm children and there are people making money from them is not a new idea. And this is an idea that has fueled vaccine hesitancy over the years. And without going too much into all of the details of the history, I just want to illustrate what happened there with the measles. So, as I said, in the US, for example, measles was already eliminated in the year 2000. But as you can see here, the measles cases worldwide have risen drastically in the last year. And this is a map from the WHO, which charts the rates per million in a 12-month period. And you can see that in the countries here marked in dark, and lots of them are in Africa as well, and that's not because of hesitancy, but because the systems are not very well set up, there are now more than 50 measles cases per million children, or people actually. And you might remember this big outbreak in Western Samoa, where the vaccine coverage had fallen below 30%, and literally the entire island got measles. That was a case where they had to close schools, where people had to stay indoors, and they had to mount a massive campaign to make sure that the measles outbreak finished. So here in Europe, we had these peaks of measles cases in 2017 to 2019. You can see it sort of waxes and wanes because it goes away once a critical mass of people has already got infected, but then the new susceptible cohort will come into the birth cohort. And you can see that all age groups were infected here. You have 10% of children under the year of 1, nearly 20% of children 1 to 4 years, 5 to 9 years, and a large group of children who were literally already teenagers, and that was largely due to the measles, to the false declarations that measles was associated with autism, and therefore parents in the late 1990s and early 2000 were not given the measles vaccines to their children, who are now teenagers at university, and they all got measles. So that's what fueled these measles cases all across Europe. And several people died, so nobody should be dying from measles. The countries affected here on this map here, you can see there were lots and lots of cases in France, which maps against the vaccine confidence map, few cases in Spain, and hardly any cases in those countries where the vaccine confidence was high and people had maintained a vaccine coverage of over 95%. So again, here we are at the vaccination status of measles, with 90% of the people may be vaccinated. You can see there's still a few susceptibles. If the vaccination coverage falls below 30–40% here, you can see how quickly this disease can affect massive amounts of population. And there has been a lot of thought given around how have we ended up in a situation where we have a potentially life-saving vaccine, and people in countries where they don't see the disease so much anymore make decisions that the risk from the measles vaccination is bigger than the benefit that they can possibly derive for their families. And here's quite some interesting cartoons to that regards, just to put the risk and benefits into a sort of ratio. This is work that was done by Peter Hotes, who is an infectious disease specialist from Texas, and he compared the effects of the disease with the effects of getting the vaccine, because we need to be honest and say no vaccine can be said to be 100% free of side effects. There can be some side effects, and we need to tell people what those side effects are, but we need to put them into perspective about the risk of getting the disease. So if you map the disease here, you have 2,000 people hospitalized. Out of those, 500 children would have gotten pneumonia, 10 to 30 would have died, and 1,000 kids would have gotten some terrible ear infection. And it would have led to about 10 cases of encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain. So the overall death rate per 10,000 was 146, and this was from the current outbreak in Samoa that I mentioned. If you compare that, of 10,000 people who have gotten the MMR vaccine, about 3 would have got a fever-related seizure, about 0.035 would have got some sort of allergic reaction. So you can just see by looking at this little blob here, compared to all the complications that you would have expected in the 10,000 people with measles, that the risks are clearly outweighed by the benefits. Influenza is another vaccine where the uptake has not been as good as people would have liked to see. And again, this is the same idea of comparing the risks and benefits. So if you go for 10,000 people who got flu in 2017 and 2018, about 4,500 of those would have to go to the doctors. About 180 would have ended up in hospital. About 14 would have died. And a very small group would have got a condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a sort of reversible neurological condition. if you look at the effects per 10,000 people who got the flu vaccine, about 0.106 would have gotten an allergic reaction, and 0.01 to 0.03 would have gotten the same condition, which is called Guillain-Barré syndrome. So again, the protection conferred by the vaccination would have by far outweighed the individual's risk. And these are individual risks. The risks to communities are measurable in a different way, but clearly the disease burden is also an enormous risk to the community because it consumes a whole lot of resources. And if you go to your casualty department or doctor in the months of December and January, you will see a lot of people with flu, and many of them will obviously infect others, but also require medical attention and maybe hospitalization. So the question is now, if we're clearly just looking at it from an economical point of view, can we pin down the economic benefits of the vaccine against the costs of the vaccines? And people have tried to argue that even the return on investment from the childhood vaccines in low and middle income countries is so much higher than the money we have to invest to get everybody vaccinated. And this graph sort of summarizes this for the childhood vaccines that we're using at the moment. So, for example, here you have the billions of dollars that are spent on a particular vaccine in orange, and you have the economic benefits as they've been calculated by cases prevented in blue. And you don't need to look too hard to see that, in general, the economic benefits outweigh the costs of the vaccine by quite a large margin. This is particularly the case for measles because the measles vaccine is extremely cheap. It is very much the case also for the vaccine against Haemophilus, which is a vaccine against pneumonia and meningitis. The ratio gets slightly different when we go to HPV vaccine because the HPV vaccine is quite expensive, but the benefits are still about 5 times higher. And it's a relatively newly introduced vaccine, so I don't think we can really calculate all the benefits of it yet. The Rotavirus vaccine is a vaccine against diarrhea, and again, it's not a cheap vaccine, but the benefits for not having children hospitalized with diarrhea or dying from diarrhea is clearly outweighing it. So you can see the cheaper the vaccine, of course, the more economic benefit you will have, but even with more expensive vaccines, the economic benefits still outweigh the risks by a large margin. So the question is, what can vaccines do to curtail a new epidemic? I'm sure that in China, they wished they had a vaccine against coronavirus already. And when the epidemic started in January 2000, just in January 2020, it started with, a relatively modest number, but clearly mainland China was the main area. And there were already many, many other countries involved. Just a few weeks later, the situation had really deteriorated and about 8 times as many people were affected. And you can see how this epidemic spread around. So if we'd had a vaccine at this point on the shelf, ready to go, we could have prevented the whole spread of this explosion of an epidemic around all these other countries as well. And how do we get to vaccines in these kinds of epidemic situations? I don't know whether you followed what happened around the Ebola crisis in West Africa about 3 years ago and what's going on in the Congo at the moment. But it so happened that a vaccine against Ebola was in fact sitting on the shelves of the National Institute of Health in the US for about 10 to 15 years. If you remember the sort of various stages the vaccines had to go through, from the concept to the preclinical to the various phases of testing in people, that vaccine had gone through the concept and the preclinical, but there were no phase 1 data, which meant the vaccine was sitting there, but we didn't know if this vaccine was safe in people. And as a consequence, it wasn't quickly deployed, although the vaccines eventually did make it into people in terms of clinical trials. And it looks we now have at least 2 vaccines against Ebola that can be deployed and are currently being deployed in the DRC and the Congo, and some other studies are going on. But they're still in trial. They're not yet licensed. So you're faced with a scenario where you have to put unlicensed vaccines into an epidemic to stop its spread. And at that point, people kind of woke up and they thought, why have we been sitting with a potentially life-saving vaccine and could not prevent this outbreak, which killed quite thousands of people in West Africa and caused a huge amount of distress to various countries. What stopped us from getting into the clinical trials? And basically, it's the investment, because for companies the majority of vaccines are made by companies and they're made by industry, and industry will only really progress with making these vaccines if there's also a profitable market somewhere out there. And sadly, an outbreak of Ebola every few years in Africa doesn't count as a profitable market. However, the whole upheaval around this disease all of a sudden changed that idea that we can leave vaccine development just to the companies. And in 2017, a new initiative was formed between industry and partnerships of governments and charitable organizations and the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, and everybody got together and they decided, if this happens again, we cannot behave like that again. We cannot have vaccines sitting on the shelf that could potentially be life-saving. We need to be able to put vaccines through phase 1 and phase 3 trials with public funding to be able to pick them off the shelf when we need them. And the initiative that was formed at the time is called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, or CEPI. And the idea is that we have a new model to fund vaccine development. And CEPI has raised, I think by now, about $750 million to prepare for the just-in-case disease that is coming. So they want to have vaccine candidates ready for a whole list of diseases. Of course, coronavirus was sort of on that list because we had outbreaks of SARS in the early 2000s, and then we had MERS, and both of those are coronaviruses. And these viruses switch with regularity between animal reservoirs and people. So people had coronavirus on their mark, but on their radar, but it wasn't yet this particular coronavirus. But there were some platforms that had already received money from CEPI to generate candidates that are now being really upscaled to get us to a coronavirus vaccine very, very quickly. And you can see here MERS, Nipah, Lassa fever, which is very much like yellow fever, is another horrible hemorrhagic fever disease. Those candidates are now being prepared through funding from CEPI. So academic institutions and industry have applied to CEPI for funds to make candidates of vaccines that are ready and can be tested in phase 1 and phase 2 when there isn't an epidemic, which means if we have the next outbreak and the next epidemic, we can upscale that production very, very quickly, and those vaccines can help us fight the epidemic. So just to round this off now, vaccines, as you've seen through the vaccines I've sort of discussed today, they are for life and not just for children. And more are we thinking about vaccines, not just for newborns and infants, but also for adolescents, for example, with the HPV vaccine, for adults. Nobody here should forget about their diphtheria and tetanus boosters before they go traveling. The HPV vaccine is in there for older people, with boosters for pneumococcus and shingles, and also for pregnant women, where we can give vaccines to women during pregnancy, for example, flu and pertussis vaccine, that will protect their babies in the very early phases after birth. And the WHO is currently working on the new plan for the 2030 agenda, which means the immunization agenda will say, come up with a global strategy to leave no one behind, working on the vision that we could live in a world where everyone, everywhere, at every age, can fully benefit from vaccines for global health, for good health and well-being. And this vision, of course, is ambitious, but it's a vision that involves a life cycle or a life course of vaccination. And we need to very carefully think about where all those vaccines can also be delivered, because there are very different platforms for children than there are for adults, for example. And maybe we need to engage more schools, maybe we need to engage more old folks' homes to help us with the delivery of those vaccines. And in the meantime, we should not forget about the thousands of children out there who are not currently receiving already licensed life-saving vaccines just because the infrastructure of their health systems does not allow them to benefit from vaccines. And with that, I want to thank you. Muchas gracias. And if you have questions, I'll be very happy to take them. Thank you.
Bueno, vamos a pasar a un turno de preguntas. El que quiera preguntar, que levante la mano y tenéis en la mesa el botón para conectar el micrófono.
Hola, muy interesante. Quería preguntar, porque has dicho que en Reino Unido cómo se distribuye la vacuna de la gripe, y aquí es diferente. Aquí se distribuye entre personas con riesgo por enfermedades, por el sistema inmune y preferentemente personal sanitario y sobre todo mayores. ¿A qué es debida esa diferencia? Porque, no sé, es cara igualmente allí que aquí, ¿no? No sé, me gustaría saber por qué esa diferencia.
Are you talking about the flu vaccine? Which vaccine are you talking about specifically?
Sí.
Yeah, the flu vaccine. So every country will have an organization which is their National Immunization Advisory Committee. It's called the NITAG. And the NITAGs make the decision of which vaccines should be introduced for their healthcare system. So it might be that the flu cases in Spain have a different distribution from the flu cases that we see in the UK, although I kind of doubt that. So I'm not quite sure why they decided to just give the flu vaccine to the vulnerable and elderly in Spain. In the UK, the modeling shows clearly we have more benefit if we also give it to younger children. I think it's a very legitimate question, which I can't answer because I don't know how the advice was developed by your National Advisory Committee. But it's a question you should ask.
Gracias.
Sí, buenas noches. Mi pregunta está un poco relacionada con la pregunta anterior, y es que en la campaña de vacunación de la gripe de este año en la Comunidad Valenciana había dos tipos de vacuna, una trivalente y otra tetravalente, creo. La trivalente la daban hasta cierta edad y la tetravalente la daban hasta cierta edad, y a partir de cierta edad, no sé si 65 años, creo que era, daban la trivalente. Yo pregunté si esto era por alguna razón económica o era porque la carga vírica no era aconsejable para las personas de más edad, pero nadie ni supo o no quiso o no supo contestarme nadie. No sé si usted me puede decir algo al respecto.
Okay, I'm glad I'm not your Minister of Health. Because, so you might know that the flu vaccine has to be remade every year because the flu virus mutates very, very rapidly. And we are not in a position where we have what is called a universal flu vaccine. And every year, the flu episodes usually start in Asia. And the vaccine that we get in the Western countries is designed by information from the genetic makeup of the flu vaccine, of the flu that they see in Asia. So they have to bring that information, and on that speculation, the best vaccine is made. Some years the vaccine is not as effective as it is in other years because the match wasn't quite as good. So the tetravalent vaccine is the better vaccine, there's no question. And I think this is probably an economic decision and also a supply issue, because if you have already started making lots and lots and lots, and there are millions of doses we need for flu, of the trivalent vaccine, and all of a sudden another company comes in with a tetravalent that might not be available or competing because your country has already decided to buy so many million doses of the trivalent, then you have an issue.
Gracias.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I have a question and kind of a follow-up on your previous point here, because I would like to know if you have any advice, practical advice, if you have family and friends that don't believe in vaccines, or just the nuances that you just brought up, that some years they work, some years they don't work so well. How do you practically convince the people around you when they don't really believe in hard data or these kind of graphs?
Yeah, it's a really important topic, and I'm glad you bring it up. And so the flu vaccine isn't the world's best vaccine. So I think the first thing is we all expect that vaccines cover us against diseases 100%. That might not be the case for all vaccines. And there is a misconception in particular with the flu vaccine because people think when they had the flu vaccine that they're not even going to get a cold, right? So they think, and there are so many stories, people saying, I had the flu vaccine, I still got ill, or I had the flu vaccine, 2 days later I was in bed. You know, I hear plenty of those stories. So the first thing is the disease of flu is not that well understood. I think it's not that easy to convince people about flu. So maybe you start off with a different vaccine that we know it works really, really well. So if you pick the measles vaccine, right, it is a very highly effective vaccine. And you can show for example, the graphs that I've just shown of the risk of the vaccination against the risk of getting the disease and also the way that it spreads. So I think people will understand that concept quite well because it's very obvious. With flu, because people confuse the disease for a start, and therefore they don't think the vaccine is as credible. That's one problem. So you have to explain to people that what they think might have been flu might not have been the flu that the vaccine was meant to protect against. So that's already a difficult discussion. And then you're going to have to give them examples of people who die of flu. And you probably have to be quite drastic. And it might well be that the people who don't want to take the vaccine are not exactly in the high-risk group. So you can say, if you're a healthy, fit person, it's unlikely that you're going to come to serious harm with flu. So you want to look up the figures or the data for people who were as healthy as everybody here in this room, who have had serious consequences from flu. They will be available from your public health organization. Then you need to think about what you do in terms of protecting people in your family. So let's say if I got flu and I was going to sit there with my 2-year-old, I would definitely give that child the flu. If I was sitting there with my elderly father, the chances of me giving him the flu and him being seriously ill are quite high. And that you can argue that even if you don't have a benefit for yourself necessarily from the vaccine, you're having an impact on what happens to your family. People are often more inclined to think about what happens to their family when they think about the community protection as opposed to they're protecting people in another country or what have you in the aeroplane, etc. So make it personal. Make it personal to try and understand what is the risk for me from having the vaccine or not having the vaccine, and then extend that risk to what is the risk to my immediate family, and that might vary depending on the disease that you're thinking about. Does that help a bit?
Thank you, very good.
Sí, no sé si hacer la pregunta en español o en inglés.
Como lo quiera.
Ok, español. Primero felicitarle por la charla y luego, respondiendo quizás a la pregunta que comentaba el compañero, este tipo de información, en este tipo de fórum con gente joven, esto es importante porque ellos actúan de altavoz para poder informar a otras personas sobre la bondad de las vacunas, ¿no? Pero relacionado con esto, ¿cuál es la explicación de que en Irán, en Rusia, en estos lugares haya gente, o en Francia, un 41% de personas que no son muy proclives a la vacuna? Esa es la primera pregunta que quería hacerle y luego le hago otra.
It's a big headache for us, and what we're trying to do is raise the profile of the benefits of the vaccine, a bit like, you know, in a sense, that's why I agreed to do this talk, right? We could be sitting here with 80% of the audience not believing in vaccines. I would have a very hard time. I would still come, but I would have a very hard time. But I think we all multipliers, and as healthcare professionals, we can influence. And people who, you know, if you're in doubt about whether you should be having a vaccine or not, usually the first person you would talk to would hopefully be a doctor, a nurse, someone that you think has got some authority in the space. The problem is that there's a lot of chat going on social media where there are no experts in the room and there's a lot of echo chambers. So that's not specific to vaccines. You know, you can almost obstruct the subject to other things where a lot of fake information is spread, and it's very difficult to break through that. So I think realizing that vaccine coverage is dropping because people are more hesitant has galvanized the healthcare professionals to be a bit more active about it, and also to engage the media in a different way. So it used to be, you know, you would have some horrendous story about someone who had a very sore arm after they got the HPV vaccine or so, and that was the headline news. You're having these stories like measles outbreaks, etc. And the media have changed. I have to say, in the UK, I've experienced that myself. I used to have a lot of discussions with journalists who, you know, were always doing the scandalous stories, and I kept saying, you know, you're getting the wrong end of the stick. And now they come to us to get information on how they should be portraying. Look at the cartoons they're developing, their media. And if every single person in this room has a network of influencers, then that is already a fantastic multiplier function. And we have people who are doing similar work in France. We've got people, and you know, the reasons I think we need to be very aware can be very different in the countries. For example, if you go to Russia, the main reason why there's hesitancy is because there's a lack of trust in the system that delivers the vaccines. The reason why there might be hesitancy in France or in Italy is because people don't want to be told what to do. So there are various different ways of approaching it, and you really need to involve a multidisciplinary group of people, including sometimes social scientists, to ask people and get that information and then try and turn it around. And obviously, if you do that one by one, it's a very stony way, but we're all multipliers in everything we say. If we see wrong information, we should correct it.
And the second question was related with the neglected tropical diseases. In the first slide you showed there were not a single word related with parasites. And just in the very last few slides you showed, you mentioned about malaria. But what about the rest? What about helminths?
Okay, so it would be wonderful to have vaccines for everything, but not necessarily it's easy to make. Malaria, there is a vaccine now. Its efficacy is around 50%, and it's currently being tested in a few countries in Africa to see if it can be introduced successfully. And, you know, you might say a vaccine that's 50% effective, that's not a great vaccine. On the other hand, if you can prevent 50% of all cases of malaria, then that would be great, right? So I'm with you on the malaria vaccine. So for the helminth, very few people die of worm infections, right? So the incentive to make a vaccine for a disease that is a nuisance rather than a lethal kind of scenario is, again, it depends on incentives as well, right? Because you need big companies to help us make these vaccines. We can, you know, organize the concepts and maybe even the preclinical work in academia, but we cannot get to producing them to good laboratory practice and GCLP products and make them in thousands of doses. So that is a job for industry and a job for WHO to then dish them out. So I think the incentive to do vaccines against helminth is very low because we also have treatments that work quite well. And we are, well, I know, yeah. Yeah, I know, and there's resistance developing, and it's great you're interested in this. And the, you know, you have to give the tablets once every 6 months to all the school children in the world and all the rest. You know, the real change with the helminth will come when people can live in a more sustainable environment, when they don't have to go and wade in water to wash their clothes, being attacked by snails that carry these parasites. So it has a lot to do with overall economic development, I think, and the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of embracing that agenda more than trying to focus on vaccines for helminth.
Okay, so I was wondering, because I've heard all your conference and I found it really interesting, but you've been talking and giving us data of how vaccines have been evolving since 1950s to nowadays. And my question is, apart from solving coronavirus, which is nowadays our most globally affected disease, what are the vaccines industry's next step when searching for different vaccines or virus which are possibly undiscovered?
Yeah. So you mean epidemic viruses? And I mean, epidemics are more caused by viruses rather than bacteria. Yeah. So the WHO has come up with a list of the 10 most likely pathogens to evolve into epidemics in the next decade or so. The first disease on that list is called disease X. And you'll be laughing about this because this is exactly what's just happened. Coronavirus was sort of similar to SARS and MERS, so it was, you know, maybe disease Y, but there will be disease X because there will be mutations. What is more promising now is that, and you might have seen from the information from China, they managed to sequence that virus within literally a couple of weeks, and the sequence was published. And because of the sequence of the organism, you can develop the antigenic targets, or you can predict what the immune system is going to see if you contact that virus. And therefore, you can, in silico, in the lab, by computer modeling, you can literally already develop what that vaccine needs to look like in order to induce antibodies with a specific potency. So I think it will be a lot quicker as we're going forward. So if we're working through all those 10 diseases, you know, there's Nipah, there's Lassa, there's chikungunya, there's dengue, those are all viruses, and the same sort of machinery can kick in. And then we have these platforms of RNA and DNA platforms now, so we don't need to make new proteins necessarily. And they literally, instead of having to connect a protein to some sugar and then put that into formulation with an adjuvant, which is quite a complicated process, you can now use the genetic information of the pathogen to literally make stretches of this pathogen as RNA, which use the body's own replication system. So they can't turn into the virus or the disease itself, but you use the sequence of the antigen that you think the immune system needs to see, and then you inject that into the body, and the body's own machinery, the cell cycle reproduction, will recreate the antigen in thousands and thousands of ways, and then the antibody will be made, and then you can fight it off. And that production is much quicker. You still have to make thousands of doses of it, but the technology is really much advanced. So I think industry is looking at that. But the problem is still, you know, you still need to make some form of profit if you're really hardcore industry. So to have something that facilitates that, or maybe we should argue, you know, vaccines for outbreaks shouldn't be left to industry. They should be supported by governments. And I think that's a discussion that's going on right now.
Good evening. Thank you for the conference. And my question is, in which step of the process of developing the vaccine of coronavirus are we?
Okay, so we are in the preclinical phase, which means we have a discovery and a construct, and it's going into various animal models at the moment. So the idea is that by the summer, the first phase 1 trials can happen. So the phase 1 trials would be to give this, what's been found well useful in the animal model and not detrimental, to healthy volunteers, and we're talking maybe 20, 30, 40 people, so it can be done quite quickly. So what you do, you don't line up 40 people, give them all the shot. You start off with 1, 2 people, see that they're fine, then you put the next 5 through, then you enlarge your group. And it probably needs to be done in more than one country as well. And at the moment, because it's very interesting, because a lot of funding has been mobilized for the coronavirus vaccine development, there are probably about 10 different candidates that are sort of coming through, and they will all want to go forward. So there is already a committee at the WHO to set the sort of go, no-go decisions and to come up with criteria that we really get the best product as quickly as possible, because there are some proposals which look very promising, but they will never be able to make the millions of doses that we'll be needing, right? So there's feasibility, there's plausibility and feasibility thinking involved, and both of those things matter a lot, and WHO is really guiding that process.
Thank you.
So next year, I think, possibly.
Okay. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Por favor.
Over there.
Hasta que tengamos la vacuna, ¿cómo podemos protegernos del coronavirus?
So the good news is there have been 2 cases in Spain. So unless you're immediately wanting to travel to China or to go on a cruise, unfortunately, these poor people who are stranded there in Japan for a long time, your risk as a person here is extremely small. So the question that if you came to my surgery now and you would say, I'm really worried that I've got coronavirus, the first question I would ask you would, have you been to China, Thailand, Singapore, So there's a whole list of about 10 countries where there have been quite a few cases. If you answered, and then my second question would be, have you sat next to someone who has been diagnosed with coronavirus infection? If your answer to those 2 questions is no, I would send you home. Right, so, and I would advise you to use alcohol gel for your hands, and if you meet people who have a cold and a cough, to stay away about 2 meters. And otherwise, it's just like flu, you know. And we are lucky that we haven't had many cases, but even if there are cases coming, I don't think it's a case of hysteria. The people who are really gotten very ill with coronavirus are usually people who've had other comorbidities, so people who had diabetes, who were very old, who already had some sort of lung problems. There are exceptions, and we don't yet understand this disease because it's very new, but healthy young people don't seem to have been very affected by it, so the mortality rate is pretty low. But still, in China, they have so many cases, which is why they have so many deaths. But no, as far as I know, in Europe, not a single person has died from coronavirus.
Muchas gracias.
Hola, buenas noches. Yo quiero preguntar sobre la vacuna del papiloma. Hasta hace unos años había que pagarla para las niñas, ¿no? Ahora veo que a las niñas sí que se las ponen en el ambulatorio. ¿Por qué a los niños no se las ponen? ¿Es que no tienen beneficios o por qué? Gracias.
Yeah, very good question as well. You are quite right. The cancers can also affect boys, not as cervical cancer, but as anal cancer, as cancer of the throat. HPV, I know, but the papillomavirus vaccine is meant to prevent certain types of cancers that primarily affect women. Cervical cancer only affects women because boys don't have a cervix. But the organism, the virus itself, can affect anal tissue and can also affect the vocal cords. So there are some men who get cancer with papillomavirus. There are much fewer. And again, it's a question of where is your biggest gain for the system? And if I was, and I am, a mother of a young boy, or he's not young anymore, but of a boy, I would have bought the vaccine if it had been around for boys at that point. So I think if you can, I would definitely give it. In the UK, they've just changed to also give the vaccine to the boys. And the problem is the vaccine is very expensive, and I'm not a believer that whether you can afford to be vaccinated should depend on your income. But if your health system isn't introducing it yet, and I think it will be a cost question, then if you have the means to do it, give the vaccine to your boys. You know, it's perfectly safe vaccine, and it will prevent rare cases of papilloma cancers in boys as well. But the biggest gain from the papillomavirus vaccine has been in women, because the infection is much more common in women, and the cervical cancer is a serious disease. So if you look at the success in the countries where the vaccine was introduced a long time ago, for example, in Australia or in Scotland, the cases have already come down and women's smears have improved since they've had the vaccine. So there's no question that this is a highly effective vaccine. And it is expensive, and because of the costs, it's been put to the girls first, but it should be licensed for boys as well. Australia always had it for boys and girls. And I don't have shares in that company, just to say. Okay. Any other questions?
Bueno, pues si no hay ninguna pregunta, vamos a dejarla aquí. agradeciendo a Beati su fantástica conferencia y esperando que vuelva pronto por aquí para contarnos buenas noticias.
Muchas gracias a todas.
Les recuerdo que tienen que... Perdón. Que devuelvan los auriculares a la salida. Muchas gracias.